We've already seen how the Medici have gained increasingly power over Florence and how that really officially takes place as Medici overtaking Florence in 1537. Alessandro de' Medici, as we've seen, was assassinated, and it was his cousin Lorenzino that did it. Lorenzino could have laid claim to becoming the ruler of Florence at that point. And yet there was another cousin, Cosimo, who also had his eyes on the rulership of Florence. And he had enough allies in Florence that made it possible for him to be a serious contender for it. Cosimo sent assassins to kill Lorenzino, and they were successful. And Cosimo, dramatically increases his position in Florence at that point. Another thing that Cosimo does to gain such absolute authority in Florence is that he has his very important marriage with Eleonora de Toledo, who was from an important noble family in Spain, and marrying her brought money to the Medici. They desperately needed it. But it also importantly allied Florence with Spain. In part because of that alliance, it is Spain, specifically it's Charles V, who recognizes Cosimo I and bestows the title of the Grand Duke of Florence and then Tuscany to him in 1537. So initially, in 1537, what's recognized is that Cosimo would be the ruler over Florence. And then he is elevated to the rank of not Holy Roman Emperor, sorry, Grand Duke of Tuscany by the Pope in 1562. In terms of the artistic production of the Florentine artist in this period, it's really very much centered around the art produced for this new court, the court of Cosimo and his wife Eleonora and their children. And around them, of course, there were the usual accoutrements of the court. You would have ladies in waiting, you would have men in various roles that would take care of the needs of Cosimo. You had, of course, governmental officials, ministers of various sorts, secretaries. It's just increasing this whole structure of a court that Florence had never had before. So Florence wanted to look like a court. Well, the Medici wanted Florence to look like a court as well. And so the kind of art that is produced in Florence in this period reflects what other courts are producing in this period, especially in terms of the types of imagery that are produced. Cosimo really supports the flourishing of that sort of second wave of mannerism, the Maniera style in Florence. And you can see that in all of the art that's produced during his reign. He had a circle of artists that were his preferred artists. Giorgio Vasari, who we started with at the very beginning of this class, was one of those artists. And some great sculptors, Benvenuto Cellini in particular, Ammannati, Bandinelli to some extent. And Vasari not only was a writer, but was a prolific painter. Bronzino was probably the most successful artist in Cosimo's circle. and was especially entrusted with doing the many portraits that were necessary for these new rulers. We see one of those portraits here, Cosimo being shown here in armor, and it's really in emulation of the kinds of portraits that were produced, especially of Charles V, and considering this alliance between Florence and the Habsburgs, it certainly makes sense in that way. But stylistically, it's quite different. Bronzino's style is unmistakable, and you have those Mannerist components that you've come to recognize, like the elongated hands that are extra gracefully perched there on top of a helmet, or the strange proportional relationships of the head. The way the eyes are inset into the head also look a little odd, though I have to say that a lot of Cosimo's portraits are that way, and he suffered from gout and may have had some thyroid issues that would explain the way that his eyes appear. The lack of background here is also one of those characteristics that we have come to recognize as being related to mannerism. So the one way you can think about these artists is that they are the artists that were the students of that first generation of mannerists, like Pontormo and Rosso. Their students go on and continue this style and certainly make some alterations to it. But in any case, what happens is that this becomes the style that's absolutely associated with this Medici rulership. While basically what happens is that classicizing Renaissance style becomes more closely associated with the Republic. So Cosimo wants to break from that kind of representation of the Republic for obvious reasons and really promotes this style of mannerism or maniera. So Bronzino is a perfect person to do that, having studied with Pontormo and certainly picked up a lot of his stylistic traits. This is a portrait of Eleonora, Cosimo's first wife, with their son Giovanni, and this is a beautiful painting by Bronzino. Bronzino and Eleonora spent a great deal of time together. He painted many portraits of her and really got to know her quite well. Yet we don't really get a sense of her personality at all in this image, and as you can see, it's very much a dynastic image where you have the woman who shows off her male offspring who will presumably become the next ruler of the city. That was not meant to be, as Giovanni dies quite young. But that's clearly what this portrait is about. What we also see here is Eleonora dressed in this beautiful gown that is made with silk brocades and has this beautiful areas where there's velvet that are in these designs, this kind of pomegranate kind of design. And even art historians have analyzed this gown, which, by the way, Eleonora was buried in, and they have recognized that even in the gown we see this connection between Florence and Spain really being made prominent, in that the material is Florentine, but the pattern that you see here is typically Spanish. So it's all about that alliance, and what a good thing that alliance will be for Florence. Eleonora, as I said, came from wealth, and that proved to be very important to the Medici of this moment, and she, because of the money she came with to the marriage, is able to help buy the works of art and commission works of art to be made, but also to buy new residence for the Medici family, as we'll see shortly. what where the Medici were living is in Palazzo Vecchio. So from the time that Cosimo takes control over Florence, um, they are living in Palazzo Vecchio and have apartments in the government building. And excuse me, Eleonora has an apartment here as well, has a chapel here, all done by Bronzino. Vasari does a lot of the interior decoration of the apartments and of some of the meeting spaces. Those are also done by Vasari, including that space that we looked at the beginning of the class where Leonardo and Michelangelo had worked. Vasari, as you'll remember, was asked to paint over those scenes with, in this case, battle scenes that celebrate the beneficial rule of the Medici. So lots of decoration going on in the interior of the space and lots of decoration happening on the exterior of Palazzo Vecchio as well. So several sculpture projects are commissioned, first under Cosimo and then under his heir Francesco. And other building projects are happening in the same piazza, including this building that is next door to Palazzo Vecchio, where the government offices will all be put together instead of being dispersed through the city. So it really centralizes the government. And that building is the Uffizi, now a painting museum, but originally constructed, designed by Vasari to be the place where the government would all be located. When the Medici are really starting to commission works of art, and this is true both under Alessandro and then under Cosimo, it makes sense that they would be commissioning works of art in the area of Palazzo Vecchio, which had been in the government building for so long. And so any statement they make there through imagery is a powerful statement. The other thing that they do is commission works of art in the traditional Medici sites like San Lorenzo, and they commission portraits of the important figures in the Medici family history, like Lorenzo the Magnificent, seen in this portrait by Vasari, and painted about 35 years after Lorenzo had died. So clearly it's a portrait that's really meant to connect the present Medici rule with the good old days of the old Medici rule, and Lorenzo's grandfather Cosimo, the founding father of the powerful Florentine line, would be recognized as important men that had done beneficial things for the city, that the buildings that they made, they did all sorts of important charitable works for the city and for their piety, and all of those things were admired. So especially the time of Lorenzo was already recognized by the Florentines as being the golden age, despite the overtaking of the city by Savonarola and eventual exile of the Medici. The time of Lorenzo was still regarded in a positive light. Looking at the area of the Piazza Signoria, the piazza right in front of Palazzo Vecchio, you have to the right of the palazzo this loggia. This loggia had been there for a couple of centuries and had been used, as a place for sculpture, certainly as a place for ceremonies in this, open arched arcade. But especially during the time of these Medici dukes and Grand Dukes, this becomes a space for sculpture that sends really significant messages. You'll be reading a couple of essays about the overall program and movements that happen to sculptures in the loggia during this period, and then a kind of focus article on one of these sculptures as well. So I won't spend too much time on it here. But it is important as we're looking at these individual sculptures to keep in mind the larger program, because all of this was meant to be read and seen together. So remember, you've got Michelangelo's David on one side of the door of the Palazzo Vecchio facade, Bandinelli's Hercules and Cacus on the other, and then Cellini's Perseus, which we'll look at, and Giambologna's Rape of the Sabine Women. Then you've got other sculptures. Some of these sculptures are ancient ones. This is another sculpture by Giambologna of Hercules. We probably won't be looking at it, however. And then there are these two large lions in stone here on the stairway as you're going up into the loggia. Those stone lions actually replaced real live lions that were kind of stationed here on the stairs during the time of Cosimo, but people complained about how badly they smelled. And so they ended up replacing the live lions with the stone ones. And surely, I mean, not only was it terribly cruel to the lions, but surely it was also a little dangerous to have these lions out like that. Anyway, just to give you a sense of the proximity of Cellini's sculpture Perseus with Michelangelo's David, you can see, even though of course the David we're looking at here is a copy, it's situated where the original one was, and you can see that it's just diagonal from it, and Cellini is very aware that his sculpture is going to be not only read together with Michelangelo's in terms of meaning, but perhaps even more nerve-wracking for Cellini, it was going to be compared to the greatness of Michelangelo's sculpture. After Michelangelo's death, and really even after Michelangelo leaves Florence in 1534, Florentine sculptors are, and painters for that matter, are really trying to be seen as being on par with Michelangelo, which is a very tough thing to do. Cellini gets frustrated and leaves Florence for a while, actually, and goes to France and works for the King of France, as several other Florentine artists did. But he comes back to Florence and comes back with a great deal of self-confidence, and he takes on a number of commissions, especially for smaller scale objects, but he's determined to do a life-size scale sculpture, and goes to Cosimo and convinces him that this is this great project to do. According to Cellini, he gets really upset because Eleonora just always seems to kind of get in his way, and he's always gets along with Cosimo, and then Eleonora comes and stirs up trouble, according to Cellini. Cellini gives us such vivid accounts of his perspective on the events that took place around this sculpture, but more broadly just in his life, in this autobiography he wrote, that an artist sees himself and his life as being worthy of recording is obviously something that comes out of the rising status of artists in this period, as we've seen throughout the class. But Cellini's autobiography is really something quite special. He is a hot-tempered guy. He is, he gives such great narrative about all of the events of his life. He tried to kill people. He did kill a few people. He was he raped a woman in France. He had all kinds of affairs with young male apprentices in his shop, one of whom he lived with for years. And it's clear that this was an incredibly meaningful relationship for Cellini, but he does eventually go to prison for it with the charge of sodomy. In Florence, as I think I've mentioned to you before, when people are charged with sodomy, it's usually more of a political thing than it is an actual charge against them having, you know, partaken in sodomy or having what we would call a homosexual lifestyle. It's usually just like a political, I don't know, maybe it's how we would use fraud today or corruption or something like that. Something to pull out against someone that you're trying to bring down. So, in Cellini's case, he really did have a lot of enemies. He must have been just a hell of a guy to try to get along with. But also, he had a lot of rivals at the court who didn't appreciate his self-confidence or maybe even his skills, and were constantly trying to make him be out of favor. There was such a climate of competition in Florence for commissions that, this kind of rivalry often got ugly. So here's Cellini's, I think it's fair to call it Cellini's masterpiece. Not a word I would use often, but something that Cellini would, I think, say about this sculpture. This is a bronze sculpture, which meant that it is molten metal that is poured into a cast. And I'm going to post a video that takes you through the process of bronze casting. It is an incredibly difficult and labor-intensive medium, and requires a great deal of skill, not only in making the molds and going through the process, understanding the exact temperature that the material needs to be at and the exact composition of the materials, but even in the pouring of it, so much can go wrong. And Cellini gives us this really rich account of, it was almost not going to work, and he had gotten sick and was laying in the bed, and so his servants had to try to take over the casting for him, and they didn't know how to get the temperature right for the metal, and so it just, everything started to go wrong. And Cellini talks about the sculpture, that his man here, Perseus, was dead, and that only Cellini, because of his great skill, was able to revive this man and bring him back to life, just like a necromancer would. And Cellini's all about the supernatural ability of sculptors. That's an incredible account. What was so complicated about this figure was, for one thing, that it has one arm up, raised up, and to be able to get the bronze to evenly pour all the way out to the top where Medusa's head is, and then all the way down into the feet and into the wings of Perseus's sandals, was just an incredibly difficult thing to do. And this is really meant to show off Cellini's abilities and knowledge of the material. We see the beheaded figure of Medusa below him. He's standing on her chest here, or her, in her abdominal area, and her body is sort of twisted around, and blood is gushing out of her severed neck. And of course, he's holding up her severed head. Here's another view of it. another, beautifully modeled male figure. And you can see, I mentioned even as I showed you Leone's Charles V in Fury, that there's some compositional parallels between the two, and Leone must have known Cellini's figure. Cellini and Leone absolutely hated each other, and Leone had tried to kill Cellini in prison, at least according to Cellini. But they absolutely despised each other, certainly saw themselves as rivals to Michelangelo's greatness. And Leone, in borrowing some aspects of this composition and yet taking it the next step by allowing the figure to be dressed or undressed, it's clear that this is all about showing off who can manage bronze the best. In Cellini's autobiography, he talks about this commission, and he writes, he was having this conversation with Cosimo. I would be only too pleased to make him a great statue, either in marble or bronze. For that fine piazza of his, he, Cosimo, answered that all he wanted as my first work for him was a Perseus. He had been wanting this for a long time, and he begged me to make him a little model of it. My dear Benvenuto, if you produce a large work which is as excellent as this little model, it will be the finest work on the piazza. Your Excellency, I replied, there are works on the piazza by the great Donatello, the Judith and Holofernes, and by the marvelous Michelangelo, the David. And these two men have proved themselves the greatest artists since the time of the ancients. But as your most illustrious Excellency is very enthusiastic about my model, let me say that I will have it in me to produce a work that will be 3 times better still. This is a great quote to really show how Cellini sees this commission as a rivalry with artists that were considered the greatest artists, greatest sculptors of Florence, Donatello and Michelangelo. Cellini, like Michelangelo in his Pietà, signs his name right across the chest of the figure, lest anyone ever doubt who had produced this amazing work. In terms of the meaning of it in the Piazza, Perseus here has beheaded Medusa, and in a way that connects it with another sculpture that was in the piazza, which was also in bronze, which was Judith beheading Holofernes. Judith's beheading of Holofernes is very much like the story of David and Goliath, where you have a person who overcomes a tyrant and is able to succeed, right? Perseus and Medusa is a different kind of story in that Medusa, this is obviously from mythology, and you've got Medusa, who was this monster who would turn men into stone. And Perseus she tormented people in that way and was, terrified people. And so Perseus goes and he slays her, which is obviously this moment of triumph that we see here. So it's like Judith and Holofernes and even the David, because it's all these triumphs over evil of some sort. And so that makes it all work together really well. On the other hand, you have some important distinctions that signal that this is being made in this particular historical moment. For one thing, when Cosimo had made his claim to power in Florence and was recognized by Charles V as the ruler of Florence, Cosimo had enacted a series of beheadings in the piazza of any of his enemies. And mass beheadings took place in this piazza. Perseus holding up the head of Medusa would clearly be a reminder to people that they could be next if they threatened the rule of Cosimo. As you'll read about, the sculptures were moved around within the loggia to create certain sets of meanings, but I'm going to leave that to the readings for you to learn about. If you think about the proximity of Perseus to David and think about the subject matter of Perseus, which is that Medusa would turn men to stone, it creates this rather interesting narrative of David being turned to stone as Perseus holds up this head. And that may be a clue into this sense of rivalry that Cellini has with Michelangelo. And so, you know, Cellini working in a medium that Michelangelo was never comfortable in, bronze, and doing it with such skill here, and really trying to outdo what Michelangelo had done in stone with the David. It's an interesting juxtaposition in terms of artistic rivalry and the struggle for high status in Florentine art of this period. A few details to show you, just so you can appreciate what Cellini's done here. I especially like this next one, if I can get it to forward. There we go. With this amazing helmet that Perseus has on and these great locks of hair. But the helmet with the wings, griffins, it's really quite impressive. And you can see Bandinelli's Hercules and Caicus here. Cellini and Bandinelli knew each other. They did not get along. Eleonora preferred Bandinelli, and Cellini really gives it to him, especially in his autobiography. He constantly makes fun of Bandinelli and his absolute lack of skill as he saw it. Here, oops, sorry. Here is the body of Medusa, all twisted up as she is under his feet. There are also figures in this incredible base of the sculpture that Cellini also made, where he does marble, shows his abilities in marble, and then you have these bronze statuettes within it, all mythological figures. This guy is Jupiter, and then you have Danae, Mercury, and Minerva as you go around. Oops. Another fountain or another sculpture group that was made for the front of Palazzo Vecchio. This one begun in 1565 by Bartolomeo Ammanati. This is the Neptune fountain, which is just down from Michelangelo's David. And you have the figure of Neptune here, surrounded by nymphs and river gods. It's, and I should say, Neptune, though it's partially covered here, is coming out of the water. See, standing up on his chariot, which is being pulled by horses. Here's the back side. There, you can see it a bit better here. The chariot is decorated with shells and other images related to the sea. This subject matter of Neptune was appropriate for the piazza for a number of reasons. First, because Cosimo had expanded the dominion of the Florentine rule to include Tuscany, and including in Tuscany the seaports of Portoferraio on the island of Elba, and Livorno and Pisa. This is incredibly important for Florence's well-being, since it had previously been, it didn't have direct access to the sea, so this was an important step. So basically, we see Cosimo here in the guise of Neptune, and this is really meant to celebrate Cosimo's triumphs in that regard. The fountain also links Cosimo with Charles V, in that there are symbols from the Capricorn horoscope, and sadly, I don't think you can see any here, except if you can make it out, there's a little ram's head. You can see a couple of them. But there are these Capricorn and star combinations that are meant to link Cosimo with Charles because it aligned them so that they would have the same astrological sign. In reality, they didn't, but Cosimo changes his birth date so that it fits in the Capricorn sign, and it not only fits in with Charles V's astrological sign, but also with Augustus. And obviously, that was an ancient emperor that Charles V wished to align himself with. So, astrology had more importance than perhaps we would like to think in the Renaissance, and it was obviously important for Cosimo. We see it here in the fountain and in other images of Cosimo throughout the city. Ammannati had won a competition for this fountain project, but not everybody was happy with it. And even today, the Florentines call Ammannati's Neptune Il Biancone, the big ugly white guy, because he's so large and so extraordinarily white. And that white of the marble is really contrasted even more with the bronze figures that are around the edges of the fountain. And people just didn't like the way it turned out, frankly. I mean, Cosimo was evidently okay with it, but it was derided by a lot of writers and certainly by Ammannati's rival sculptors as not being really so great. In this sculpture in the same piazza, the equestrian monument to Cosimo I, we have a really important statement about Florentine power here. This was done not when Cosimo was ruling, but instead when his son Ferdinando I was ruling. And it's a statue that's obviously meant to commemorate Cosimo, but it also, because of the equestrian monument type, really ties it to the imperial equestrian monument tradition, and thus presents Cosimo as being an absolute ruler, exactly in the same ways as the ancient Roman emperors had been. There were certainly other equestrian monuments that have been produced in Italy in the Renaissance, but this is the first one in Florence. Florence had always really had an aversion to equestrian monuments because of what they signified in terms of imperial or absolute authority. Since you're working on these sculptures in your project, I hate to say too much more about them, but this is, this was quite an engineering feat as well, in that obviously because of the size of this group and the weight of the group, it was a very difficult casting of the bronze, and even difficult to transport it the short distance that it needed to go from Giambologna's shop to the piazza. Giambologna becomes the most famous sculptor in all of Europe after Michelangelo's death, and he works he, is always working at the Medici court, even though he wasn't actually a Florentine by birth. He actually came from Northern Europe, from Belgium, and came to Florence quite young and really did well there as the sculptor to the court. So he does this equestrian monument, he does a couple of sculptures, as we'll see in the Loggia dei Lanzi. He's treated exceptionally well by the court. He's given a house in an important neighborhood in Florence. His works are shipped all over all over Europe from Florence as diplomatic gifts. This is especially a period when people are using works of art to help make friends, make important political alliances. The Medici use works of art, especially sculptures, as gifts because of the recognized superiority of Florentine art, or perceived superiority of Florentine art. It was so sought after throughout Europe that it was a meaningful and very desirable gift to receive from Florence. This is the Rape of the Sabine Women, so another sculpture by Giambologna, one you'll be reading about because of the imagery that's included in it. I should say about this image, this was before the last cleaning. You can see it's just terribly streaked, but it has since been cleaned and is pristine now. Giambologna here, like Cellini, wants to show what he's capable of and shows us three figures that actually come from one block, and they spiral upwards in this beautiful composition that shows movement. This kind of spiraling action is really dynamic and inventive and allowed for multiple viewpoints, which is something, as you've seen, sculptors really tout as something that only sculpture allows you to have. The subject matter relates to the foundations of Rome, or the story about the foundations of Rome. And in this period, Florence is really trying to present itself as a new Rome. And so showing a sculpture group about the Rape of the Sabine Women, which was associated with the beginnings of the Roman, of the city of Rome, really connected to what Florence's aspirations were in this period. You can see that as well in that equestrian monument we just looked at. You can see it in the Hercules sculpture by Bandinelli, and then the one that Giambologna does, since Hercules was one of the legendary founders of the city, in the same way that Romulus and Remus were for Rome. And it relates to, you can see it in the decoration of Palazzo Vecchio, where in Vasari's images you even see SPQF instead of the SPQR that you would see all over Rome. It's an amazing sculpture group, and certainly a tour de force in the possibilities of marble sculpting, to get three figures out of one block and have them be dynamic and arms and legs extended, lots of open space between, was really quite an impressive thing to be able to pull off, and allows for many viewpoints, as you can see. Inside in Palazzo Vecchio, you have the battle scenes that Vasari made, which were meant to cover over those pro-Republic scenes that Michelangelo and Leonardo had begun. Just to show you some, here's one of the victory at Montemurlo, one of the military triumphs of Cosimo I. So, really supplanting any image of pro-Republic battles with pro-Medici, which obviously makes sense considering this was now the Medici residence and the headquarters of their rule. Here in the center of the ceiling is an image of Florence crowning Cosimo I with oak leaves, and you have this image of the apotheosis of Cosimo, which again ties Cosimo, goes back to these ancient precedents where you would see ancient Roman emperors shown in the moment of apotheosis in the same way. Here's Cosimo seated among his artists and architects, and you can see that they are here. This is a sculptor named Montorsoli. This is Vasari, and Vasari has actually painted this. And I'm trying to remember who some of these other guys are identified as. But anyway, just a group of the sculptors that were sculptors, artists, architects that were working for Cosimo. Cosimo had begun the academy, which I told you about as we were looking at Michelangelo's death. And in this image, we see Cosimo's kind of rulership over art in Florence, which he really did have as he officiated over the academy and really monitored the output of Florentine artists during his rule. This is not a great image, but shows you Eleonora di Toledo's chapel, which was in Palazzo Vecchio, and this was done by Bronzino. So all of the apartments were repainted, including these living spaces that the Medici had taken over. This is another little space done by Francesco de' Medici, who was Cosimo's heir to the rulership of Florence, at least for a while, before he was killed by his brother, who then took over, Ferdinand. But this is a little studiolo that Francesco commissioned, a little space for him to go and study and have some peace and admire these interesting collections of objects that he stored in the cabinets that are in here. Each of these paintings is actually a door on a door that opens up to a little cabinet space inside. This is an image of Perseus setting Andromeda free, which is one of the cabinet door paintings. And inside of that cabinet were examples of coral. And this is the legend of how coral was begun, which was from the blood of Medusa, which is being fished out of the sea. It's now hardened into stone, just as Medusa turned men into stone. The discovery of glass. So there was glassware inside. And you can see stylistically, these paintings are very much still in that Mannerist style. This is the Mines of Potosi, which we should have a little thing link presentation about. But this is, represents going into the New World and locating the silver mines in Potosi and bringing silver back to be used in the Old World. And here's a little cabinet in pietre dure. That's this, what becomes a totally Florentine product of using different pieces of beautiful precious stones and making essentially mosaics out of them and making pictures out of them. And this becomes a kind of Florentine product that was shipped out and again very desired by the other courts in Europe. And I will stop here and start the next video talking about Vasari's architectural projects for the Medici.